Hello, beautiful people. Thank you for joining me on this live. So this is day 3 of Lend Me Your Ears, and today we will be discussing project risk. So yesterday we spoke about the 5 elements when forming a strategy, or at least when forming a strategy, the things that you can consider. And I introduced the concept of 5 elements because that helps you to then check off very strategically all the elements of a typical business, all the things that often get us into trouble, all the things that often help cause us to get unstuck, or where problems kind of arise. And so that's exactly why today we're talking about risks, because when we start to look at those 5 elements, and if I review those 5 elements again, they are information, people, technology or technical items, processes and timings. We naturally always start to see some things going wrong or potential issues happening, or we forecast where we could potentially have obstacles which could impact some form of the project. So that's probably a great place to start. Today I want to talk about firstly what are risks. So now, most people do understand what a risk is, but I do want to clarify because sometimes people do misunderstand. So a risk is something that could cause the project a problem, but it hasn't yet been realized. So if it is actually has, or if it's been realized, or if it's something that is actually impacting us right now, then this has transitioned into an issue. But if it's not yet gotten to that point and it's something that we can forecast, however likely or unlikely it is to happen, it is then considered to be a risk. So in a lot of cases, we can find a solution to risk, or at least minimize the impact of the risk. And I would refer to this as mitigation. So we would find a strategy in which we can mitigate that risk. So sometimes it might be we're not hit by that full blow of whatever the issue, whatever the risk is. However, we can soften the blow to some extent, or in best case scenario, we can remove it altogether. And then and there are also instances, however, where we realize that this is something that is definitely going to turn into an issue. But what do we accept it? What do we do? Maybe we decide to stop the project, or perhaps we just accept that it is going to be, it will be realized as an issue. This is the date, and maybe then we change our strategy. So it might mean that we make sure that we have certain items completed before this particular date that happens. And I will talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Or perhaps we just know it's going to happen and we prepare for it. So we sandbank our borders so that when we do know that the flood's going to happen, we try and minimize the blow, but we know that we're going to be hit by that flood. So that's an example. So that's essentially what a risk is. And then when there is an element of risk, what we want to be thinking about is what do we need to consider? What do we need to know? What information do we need to start investigating, asking people? Who do we need to be speaking to be able to then find the right strategy? So it might mean to be able to mitigate, or maybe to accept it altogether. Who should be involved? So who are the people that we need to be speaking to? Again, to soften it, to mitigate it, or to just accept it. And then what can we do? What is the strategy in which we take to then to find the right solution to be able to deal with the risk? So the best way, so the reason I introduce this now, and often a lot of projects actually start talking about risks later down the track. So anybody familiar with projects will have heard of a risk register, and often I find risk registers are introduced later down the track, where people start to really develop when they're actually starting to do the work itself. But the problem is that, and this is actually a lot of the issues, or a lot of the reasons why people start to get unstuck. People start to have serious issues around what kind of scope that they are developing to begin with, whether it is right for this project and whether it is right for this delivery team or not, whether the timings that we've considered are right or not. So if we start to think about them at the very beginning, when we're actually thinking about the strategy, and again, it really is irrelevant as to when you come onto the project. Even if the strategy has already been mapped out, there's no reason why you can, whenever you come onto the project, you can't start asking these questions around these strategies. And then that will help you. And you don't have to deliver that in the sense that I'm trying to make sure you've done a good job on your strategy or when you've considered your strategy. But it's more about, from my job, to be able to make sure that I'm doing the best job possible and that I have all the information available to me. You absolutely want to start asking people about, who are the people that need to be involved? Who are the people that this particular project is intended to benefit? Is there a smaller group of people or a larger group of people? And when I'm starting to ask those sorts of questions, I start to then realize, well, actually, this has a cascading effect. So maybe most people have seen a change management issue that is going to arise from this project, but maybe it actually impacts more than just one team. It impacts multiple teams for various reasons. So this is why it's really good for whoever it is on the project to start asking these questions, because everybody has a different perspective. We all have a different focus because we all have a different skill set. And so when we all ask the same questions, we will naturally get a variation to what responses we get. And that just means that as a team, we're actually thinking about a much more whole-proof strategy going forward, because we've all considered a different element, and therefore we can start to reinforce our project to make sure that we have catered to any of those risks. And this is exactly what why I'm talking about the risks. So typically, as I say, later down the track, there would be a risk register, but I always suggest you start a risk register, even if it is in a very raw form and it's not part of how the process works. If you are aware of a risk, you should be putting it somewhere. And maybe this is like the raw register to begin with, that is then converted into something else. Although I don't see why we wouldn't be able to just start the register at the very beginning. But I'm not here to necessarily change all of your processes, but I am here to give you these tips about these things that you should absolutely be recording as soon as possible, as soon as you start to see these things coming up. So then that leads me into what would you find in a risk register? And then after that, I will talk about some examples of risks that we encounter. So within a risk register, so again, if we're thinking about the 5 elements, we're thinking about information. An example of a risk would be that we do not have access to that information, perhaps because the people who initially, let's say, for example, we're looking at producing a new report, and there are certain elements on that report which we need explanation. We need to understand the rationale as to why these things were put onto the report, what business rules were considered when they were actually developing the report, because there may have been some formulas and what have you that we need to factor in. Now, it may be that whenever this report was developed, it was some time ago, and the people who developed it are no longer with the company. So there is a risk that we don't actually know all of the potentially the formulas that go into the report. But even if we do know the formulas, we don't necessarily know why people have used those formulas, and we don't know how critical they are to the outcome or how uncritical they are to the outcome. So when let's say we're reproducing a new report, we might think that perhaps some of these things no longer make sense to put into the new report, as an example. But because we don't understand the rationale, let's say we create this new report without those things on there, and then it breaks the formula. It doesn't give us the true figure that we want because we didn't actually understand the backstory. So that is absolutely a risk. And then we need to start to think about ways in which we're going to overcome this risk. And because we're talking about it, one of those strategies might be you introduce like a test site, for example. So you test out an example of what would happen if I was to just mock this report up, in the way that I want to do it, thinking that maybe I don't need to know what those other business rules are. What would happen? Would things break? Would those formulas still work? Will it give me the outcome that I'm expecting to get? So it's almost like you're doing a prototype. So that might be one way of mitigating the overall risk. And that might also be one risk when you're thinking about the information factor. When you're thinking about the people factor, there are so many more things that can come into consideration. So a very, very typical example is change management. So let's say the people who are going to receive this new change don't want it. And they don't want it for a multitude of reasons. But one of those very common reasons is that they fear this new automation, this new improvement, whatever it might be, actually risks their job. So because this is a new technology and they are not comfortable necessarily at first with new technology, so if they can't adapt, they feel that maybe This is going to question their survival, in terms of the company itself and whether people are going to want them, whether their skills are going to be relevant. So this is a very, very real risk, and it happens so many times and time again. So it's really in every delivery team's best interest to consider this upfront, because, and even if it's not something that you are anticipating, I would always suggest planning for it. What would happen if you did have somebody like that in the delivery team that you rely on as a subject matter expert, as somebody who needs to test out whatever it is that you need to roll out? Because if you can plan for something like that, then you're already leaps and bounds ahead because you've planned for it. So if it does eventuate, you just kick that mitigation strategy in and you're fine, and then you work through the process. But if you haven't, then you need to start taking more time and then working out, how am I going to overcome this? What is the strategy? And that absolutely bites into your time that you've planned to roll out this project. So that's an example of people. Technology and processes, if they're not known, it's harder for you to develop the right solution. If you don't have access to the right technology or processes, the same thing will happen. You will have issues in terms of the quality of project development that you roll out. You will have issue in terms of gaps that perhaps you have, because if you don't know certain things, then you can't plan for them. If you don't have access to certain systems, for example, it might put you behind because you don't know how to get into them. There are a multitude of reasons as to why you need to be considering the technology and the processes. And then the timing. And yesterday I did talk about the stakeholder accessibility. So if you can't access people, or better yet, this is something that comes up quite frequently. If, let's say, you need to roll out a project, you've told people what the impacts are, but yet you're a bit light on when it comes to really managing those stakeholders, because as soon as you start to see the writing on the wall, you haven't pounced and sort of said, look, we need this by this date, and you're really on top of it, then what will happen is you're trying to play good cop, as an example. Your stakeholders don't get back to you as quickly as you would want them to, or as they should. And then the output of that is you end up having to wait for your stakeholders to come back to you before you can make the next step, before you can roll out the next phase, before you can sign off whatever it is that you've created. So these are all things that happen very, very commonly, and these are all examples of risks. Now, so before I talk about the strategy, how you can overcome some of those things, actually, no, I will talk about that because we're already discussing it. Something like that, and often I hear people say to me, but these are things that are outside of my control. And I challenge you on that because I don't think that they are. If, for example, and I use this as an example because you can see how black and white it is. So no offense intended. But as part of my value system, I do not accept or tolerate racism, as an example, towards anybody. And so for me, I make no negotiation on this. I don't politely tell people that I don't tolerate racism. I just don't. It is in my demeanor, it is in my words, it is in everything that I do and the way that I am, because it's just not something that I will ever tolerate. Now, on a project, if, for example, my role is to protect my team so that they can deliver the best outcome for the client who we've engaged, then it is my responsibility to make sure that we exchange, whatever the thoughts are on various items. We agree between our client and the delivery team, whatever we want to achieve and what our commitments are. But once we've done that, we have locked those things in. It is then my responsibility to make sure that I'm very firm and that I do not negotiate on certain things unless we have to. And there is a formal process in which you negotiate. So it's not to say that you can't change boundaries. You absolutely can, and you do need to be able to be flexible and adapting on projects, certainly. However, there needs to be a specific process in which you achieve it. And that way you make sure that you maintain accountability, you uphold expectations, and that you end up delivering against the commitments that you have made to your team, as well as to your stakeholders. And that is absolutely your responsibility. But I also say it's your responsibility as the project manager, as well as anybody else on the team. If you start to just do the right, the so-called right thing by accepting things and doing a bit more than what was agreed or anticipated, then the danger you fall is that because you take something on without going through the formal process of knowing exactly what the involvement is, you haven't unpacked it in the standard process or procedure, then you potentially are committing your team to doing way more than they have the ability to take on. So you are really shooting yourself in the foot, but not just that, you're actually taking a team down with you. So, and then you're agreeing to do something with your stakeholders that you may not be able to deliver on. So it's not a good experience for anybody. So sometimes, rather than thinking about, I'm trying to do the right thing by my stakeholders, hold on for a moment. Just think about, okay, what is the process so that I can empower not only my team, myself, my team, and my stakeholders, so that I give them the right answer, which is the accurate answer, or as much as I can. So I do always say, and look, there will always be some stakeholders who are very unreasonable. And then it's your choice as to whether you want to continue conducting business with them, and how you run your own practice and how you run your own delivery teams. Absolutely, that's up to you. And we all have our own degrees of what we will and will not tolerate. However, you can't say that these are your boundaries, but then you don't stick to them. So you need to make sure that you are sticking to them. And this does fall into the category of risk, because then you do risk, scope, budget, accountability, timelines, and a whole myriad of other things, and also quality of outcome. So then the way I will end today, or before I talk about examples actually, is the way in which we capture risk, whether you're doing this now or whether you're doing it later, is you want to identify what the risk is. So I would have a name, which is a short name, so that it can be referred to in multiple places, such as like a progress report, or when you're speaking to your stakeholders, and everybody starts to know what that means. And then also a description, and the description needs to be quite succinct. You need to be able to reflect, who is this impacting? What kind of an impact is it going to have on the project, as well as any other stakeholders, and as well as on any of your commitments? So that would be the name. And an example would be, for example, that the project purpose or scope is vague. And the description is that it's not well defined, or it hasn't been captured by the right audience, or whatever it might be. So and then you would ideally, I would date stamp or time stamp that to say, when was it captured and who was it captured by. It just gives you an anchor point to go back to somebody, or how long this thing has been outstanding for. And then you want to put in, which is really critical, the likelihood of this risk happening. So is it, and there are various ways you can grade it, but highly likely, moderately likely, or low in terms of likelihood. And then the impact. So it might be unlikely. However, the impact, for example, will actually be that it will have a major impact. So, and when we say major impact, it will affect or impact one of your commitments. So your commitments might be the timeline, it might be your budget, it might be your scope, it might be the benefits that you deliver, for example. It might be the adoption rate, that might be the engagement of your stakeholders. So these are all the impacts of that could be realized if this risk was to convert into an issue. And so therefore you've actually, you've seen it, you've realized it. So that would be the impact. And then depending on how you rate your or how you manage your risk register, that would then, you can use those two grades to determine what the severity to your project is. So let's say, for example, if it's a low likelihood and it's a low impact, then it's probably a low severity. But if it's and typically you would have a matrix. So if you want to know more information about this, reach out to me either on this Facebook feed, or you can reach out to me at info@projecting.com.au. I do have various templates I can help you with, and it's one of the things that I go through in detail in all of my trainings, as well as coaching sessions too. And then you want to have the owner of the risk. So it needs to be somebody's responsibility to work through this and make sure that they solve this particular risk. And either it's solved or it's going to be realized, or whatever it might be, but somebody needs to own it, so that you can make sure somebody is driving it. And then what is the mitigation? So what is the action that you're going to take to be able to minimize that blow if you can? And sometimes the mitigation is that you're going to realize it. And then ideally, I also put a contingency. So let's say we can't, the ideal mitigation, we can't achieve it, but what is the second contingency backup plan, if you like? I also put a progress. So if it's something that's an ongoing risk, for example, you track a progress of it. And then the other thing that's really important, if you know it, is that if you know that this is going to happen at, let's say, for example, if we're talking about a thunderstorm, I know that there's a high risk that we're going to have a thunderstorm on this date. As we get closer to that date, we realize we know exactly when that's going to hit. So I need to start sandbagging because I know that this is the date it's going to hit and we're going to be impacted. So that would be an example of what date you will realize this. And then you want to try and put in some strategies in which will help you to avoid being severely impacted by that particular date. So those are examples. And then examples of risks are project not being wanted, stakeholders not being available, the budget is insufficient, scope creep, we know all about that, landscape not what we had anticipated. So we start to lift the lid and we realize this is way more than what was actually described. And all of these risks can actually start to be identified when you are going through your why, your project why, as well as when you start to question your 5 strategies, your 5 elements of to develop a strategy. So these are things that are often risks, but if you start using the methods I've already outlined, you will have a much better opportunity to be able to resolve them or to be able to identify and plan against them, or even to avoid them altogether, which is really the ideal of what we're always trying to achieve with risks. But whatever it is, once you've identified it, it is your responsibility that you make sure that you continue to manage it. It can't be something that is in a register, locked away under lock and key that nobody ever looks at. So critical risk should actually be in front of you. So whether that's your project plan, whether you have a sticky board of risks, whatever it might be, or if it's a project or if it's a risk register, you need to have it open every single day so that you are reviewing it every single day. It's something that needs to move, because otherwise we already know what those impacts are if we realize them. So we're trying to avoid them, and you can't avoid those things from happening if you don't even know what they are, if you never look at them. So it's something that needs to be registered or looked at every single day. So I'll wrap it up there today. I hope you found today's session useful. Thank you again for tuning in. I've loved your company, and I will see you tomorrow.